Church events like this can be a highlight of a kid's year. They see their friends here at church and they get real excited. They know that new activities are planned just for them. They know that they're going to have a great time at church. And, children's ministry workers work real hard to make events like this happen. Whether it's an annual event for kids of all ages like we're having here today, or if it's weekly Sunday school, there's nothing like the wide-eyed wonder of seeing kids learn about Jesus for the first time, or maybe in some fresh, new, exciting ways. Hey, Ethan, Emily, how are you guys? Good to see you. You guys excited for Big Blast Day?
Yeah!
Great. Mom, just make sure they check in with Miss Karen in a few minutes, okay?
No problem.
That's great. You guys have a good time, all right? We take great care to make sure kids are safe when they come to church. But sadly, some kids' experience will be marred by child sexual abuse. Now, no church wants to admit that something like that could happen in their community, but it does. Now, the Catholic Church, as well as Protestant faith communities, have gone to great lengths to deter predators from abusing kids sexually in their churches. But more still needs to be done. So let's take a look at what one church has done to prevent child sexual abuse from happening here, and also take a look at what you can do to start creating your own child protection program at your church. There's nothing like leading a child to Christ. The innocence and wonder, it's the essence of what Jesus reminded us to be like. Children's ministry workers strive to preserve that innocence, both spiritually and physically. One of the ways that we can protect kids physically is through some basic safety precautions. Take this room for example. There's a lot of preparation that went into making sure that the furniture was safe, that the floors aren't too slippery, that the outlets are covered, and even that the cords are safely tucked away. Most of us don't have a hard time buying into the idea that even some small toys today can present a choking or other safety hazard. And yet when it comes to child sexual abuse, many people still don't believe that the danger is real or that implementing a child protection program is very doable, even when your children's ministry is stretched real thin.
Child sex abuse is something that's never happened in our church. I don't really see it being an issue.
Seems like child sex and abuse in the church is an issue that's blown way out of proportion. I'm sure there's some instances, but I don't think it's as big of a deal as people make it out to be.
It's hard enough to get volunteers for a children's ministry. The last thing we need is another hoop for them to jump through.
We already require our volunteers to go through teacher training. I don't want to spend a Saturday in a church classroom watching some boring training video, especially on a topic that probably won't even affect our church.
I'm all for the idea of a child sex abuse prevention program, but it's just too complex to implement. Unless it's easy to duplicate for all my volunteers, it just won't work.
There's no way I could ask a 10-year veterans children's leader to submit to a criminal background check. It's an invasion of their privacy. I just don't feel comfortable asking someone from my church to look into their life like that.
These are understandable objections from your children's ministry workers or your congregation towards a children's protection program. Children's ministries are typically the busiest programs in the church and have far fewer volunteers than they need. At the same time, we rely on Sunday schools and youth programs to help introduce our kids to Christ. Now, when a child has a good church experience, they're more likely to grow in their faith as well as stay involved with the church. However, when a child suffers from child sexual abuse at church, the effects are devastating and last for that young person's lifetime. Look around this room. Which one of these kids deserves to be subjected to that level of risk?
My name is Wesley. The summer between my junior and senior year in high school were extremely turbulent. I grew up in a small town in Arizona. I was in church from the day I was born. My family would attend church so often it seemed like it was a second home. My relationship with my youth pastor developed pretty normally. He became a youth leader in the church when I was, I'd say, a freshman, and I was pretty committed to my Christianity, to my walk with the Lord. I just loved going to youth group. I loved being involved. I eventually became the worship leader at our youth group. As we got to know each other, we went through different Bible studies. We became like family. It was the best thing you could ever imagine. I mean, he was the best friend I'd ever had. He was the safest person I'd ever been around. He was so fun, and it was great. One day, my youth pastor came to my house, and he just had a blank face. He said to me that he just needed a hug, and he just wanted to know that he was loved by someone. It was really strange. It was really awkward, and I didn't know what to do. It's so strange and so different and so uncomfortable. I was left wondering, what's going on with my youth pastor? What's going on with this guy? He's my mentor. This guy's always been so strong. And why is he so messed up right now? What's going on? So he left, and then he came back about 20 to 30 minutes later, and he gave me this envelope, and it was thick, and I had no idea what was in it, and he just said, "Wesley, I want you to give this to my mom when you think the time is right." As I stood there with him, I asked him what was going on, and he told me that he was going to commit suicide. As he was taking off, I looked down, and in the passenger seat was a 6-shooter revolver. And I called my friend, and we met at Taco Bell, and we talked. And we decided that we can't do anything, so we're going to call our parents. We eventually all decided to call the police. And the police searched all night for our youth pastor and eventually found him in a town about 50 miles north, sitting in his car with the gun in his hand. He got checked into a mental hospital, and when he got out of the mental hospital, he convinced me that I needed to move out of my parents' house because my parents told me that I wasn't allowed to be around this guy if I wanted to live at their house. I told my parents that, I have to be there to encourage this guy. He would be there for me, and, I'm going to be there for him, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. So I moved out of my parents' house, and I moved in with a friend from the church. They tried to talk to me about it and tried to start pulling me away from this youth pastor and separating me from him. And I was not going to have any of that. What would happen is I would go over to this youth pastor's apartment that he had behind his parents' house, and I would go hang out with him just to spend time with him and to make sure that he wasn't too lonely. We would watch movies, and we would hang out pretty often. We did all kinds of things together still. And there was one night where things were not normal, and things were definitely inappropriate. One night, we were watching a movie, and I had fallen asleep. I woke up to something that wasn't so pleasant. My youth pastor was abusing me. I had no idea what was going on. The next morning when I woke up, I thought it was just a bad dream, and I thought that I was going insane. It was like my world had fallen apart. I started asking myself, am I gay now? Is there something wrong with me? What did I do to deserve this? Why is my best friend, my mentor, my youth pastor, someone that became more important to me than my own family, why am I being betrayed like this? It really destroyed my relationship with God. It really did. Because I thought that God didn't care anymore, and I couldn't believe that He was good. What good God allows something like this to happen? In His church, to His children. The pain never stops. It never stops. It just sort of becomes a part of who you are. My parents went and spoke to the senior pastor of our church. No one was listening. No one. I have to decide what to do with this. Am I going to choose to let this destroy me? Or am I going to choose to bring God glory because of it?
Wes's story is tragic, and sadly, though the details are different from victim to victim, one common thread links every story together. You can't tell who is a sex offender and who isn't. In Wes's case, his youth pastor seemed like a great guy at first. As time went on, unsettling events started fitting together until eventually Wes and his family could no longer deny that the man they trusted with their son was actually his abuser. What makes his story doubly tragic is that the church placed the burden of proof and protection on Wes. Although Wes was an older teen when he was sexually abused, as a minor, it was not his responsibility to protect himself. Children, whether they're 7 or 17, are not expected to use perfect judgment. That's one of the main reasons our legal system entrusts them to our protection until they're adults. When Wes relives his abuse, he wonders why he didn't see the signs and make better decisions concerning his own self-protection. What a tragedy. As the church, we bear the full responsibility for protecting children. So, what can a church do to safeguard the kids in their care? Well, we gathered a group of experts who deal with preventing and responding to child sexual abuse cases. We'll hear from Roger Duffield, Ron Erkley, Steve Henney, Michael Bland, and our facilitator, Peter Persutti. Here's what they had to say.
Maybe the first question is, why do we have sex offenders in our church communities?
You boil it down to the fact that we live in a broken and fallen world. The reality is anybody has the potential to move down a pathway that is not healthy, that does not respect the boundaries of other individuals, and slowly move themselves to a path where they could harm another individual.
It's first of all important to state the reality. Sexual offenders are part of all faith communities. Child sexual abuse has become a household term.
One of the cases that I had that we've recently been involved in, the gentleman had worked at the daycare worker, or as a daycare center for about 3 years. The reason was he'd gotten divorced, he wanted to be near his son, and they had done a little bit of a background check, but not a full background check. And then 3 years into it, about 5 years ago, over a summer period of time, they moved the room that the kids were in to a back area where they couldn't observe and walk by and make sure that nothing was going on. And that's when the abuse took place. When I look at it, from my experience, I still have kind of a hard time believing that this guy was a perpetrator or a pedophile, because he just didn't show any of those types of traits prior to that. But he pled guilty, and he's sitting in jail for life now because of that incident.
When I came on staff, I kind of put on that offender eye and thought, where would I go? And I knew that we had our children's ministries kind of covered, and we were screening them and stuff. I wouldn't go there. I'd go to a ministry or some other place where minors are serving. Not where they're being served, like in a child's ministry, but where they are serving, especially the teenagers. And there's a high rate of abuse of teenagers that is often not reported. We always think about the little children, but teenagers are often more susceptible, and any one of a number of ways. We could talk about it in terms of, rage and anger, all the way to the point of sexual abuse.
Most offenders know their victims. It is not strangers abusing children.
Yeah.
It is people who are known to them. So if the offender is looking for a child-friendly environment where good works is rewarded, where it's a community environment, where interaction with children is encouraged, and they can have easy access, we're somewhat talking about the church. In any denomination, offenders look for child-nurturing environments, and faith communities are child-nurturing.
Does anybody want to comment maybe about why you think there is an uptick in claims? Is it any different from 20 years ago in terms of the offenses or whatever?
I don't know that I see an uptick in claims, but I mirror exactly what you've said, Steve, is we see it less with clergy and more with staff and personnel and even volunteers. What we see is kind of somebody doesn't go in through the normal system. They may be a part-time worker or volunteer just going to help out with this program. They kind of bypass the regular protocols, either out of convenience or need or what have you, and that's where we're seeing our issues.
I would think that the reason why we are experiencing an increase in claims or an increase in allegations is simply because of awareness. Both children and parents have been taught to be able to talk about sexual abuse, to be able to talk about feeling uncomfortable when someone touches them or grooms them. They first groom the children to be able to say they're a good person, that they can be friendly, maybe you could bend the rules with me a little bit, maybe you could, use dirty language, or we could go off by ourselves, or I'll give you rewards or gifts or presents without your parents knowing. But at the same time, offenders groom the adult community around them as well.
Exactly.
That they are often very charismatic people, very giving people, very genuine people who have a lot of gifts and talents to share within a community, and therefore most faith communities welcome them. And even within that, I know in various communities that I've been involved in, some of them have said, well, I've done this for so many years, why don't they trust me now? Or this isn't right, or of course I should be able to do this. And I think the answer has to be twofold. Yes, it is out of the reality of sexual abuse, and yes, it is to keep children safe. But I think we have to stop and acknowledge it keeps the adults safe.
Absolutely.
Because although it's a very small percentage, there are some false allegations. And if there's a second adult present who is not related, who is just in a ministry with someone, can say, I was there and you were not alone with a child. So the two-adult rule is not only for the safety of children, it is for the safety of the congregation as well as the individual adults involved.
It's one thing to have good ideas, but if you don't have a structure in place that really keeps the ball moving forward and keeps that issue of protection alive, it will eventually die out.
One of the things we wanted to talk about was this whole issue of the damages, and the damages could begin with you, Steve, relative to the quantifiable aspects.
A lot of this has not been covered, so overall, though, just to use an example, the Catholic Church has probably paid out in excess of $2 billion. This takes away money from the church that they could use for other stewardships that the church would have. And I don't think people really take that into full appreciation. And then I think there really is almost a non-monetary type of aspect to this, too, that I don't think gets factored in, and that's, parishioners or attendees of the church becoming disillusioned with what's going on and the fact that they don't feel their church has addressed it properly, and therefore they're leaving the church and they're maybe going to a different denomination. You can quantify a lot of this, but there's also a lot of non-quantifiable.
When we start looking at the rippling effect, it does affect then a whole congregation, not only financially, but emotionally and from a faith base. We start asking the famous questions of what if and why, and there's not always answers. In our own faith communities and in our ministries, I would say if we are able to identify that child sexual abuse is a reality in our society, even if it's not one of our ministers or clergy persons doing the abuse, fathers, stepfathers, uncles, our church members are being abused. And what are we going to do about it? And in our faith communities, what we have to be able to present is that child sexual abuse will not be tolerated in our faith communities.
A lot of times, allegations that come forward or concerns that volunteers may have aren't about something that's happening with one of the volunteers, but a child comes in with a bruise, or they seem to be acting differently. And it's not just a particular bruise, but it may be, especially in terms of a pattern. This child always seems to be coming in with bruises, or used to be very happy and outgoing, and now they're quiet, and now they're fearful of certain people, maybe within the ministry. I don't want to be near that person. Can I go be a part of this group or something else? With adolescents, you may see a host of different kinds of things, a lot more acting out behavior, getting promiscuous or cutting themselves, ways that they're basically trying to say, something's wrong, I don't know how to handle this, help me, see my signs.
Child sexual abuse is not denominational. It is a public health issue. It is looking for leaders for a solution in keeping children safe, reaching out to victims and survivors, and identifying offenders. The church of every denomination that faces the reality of child sexual abuse is losing a lot of their stewardship in their money, in their resources, in their faith and in their credibility. And that's why we have to realize that this is a public health issue that is crying out for a leader, and let that leader be our faith communities.
As the director of my church's children's ministry, one of the hardest things I have to get my head around is the fact that anyone can be a sex offender. Yes, anyone. Recently, I heard the story of someone who helped me better understand this truth. His name is Scott. He's a former sex offender, and I'd like you to hear his story.
That was God's grace that brought Paul to his knees. And it was God's grace that lifted him up. And in my life, I know that I'm a living example of God's grace. No discipline is easy, but painful. But afterwards comes a time of peace and maturity. Although I was raised in a church, I never read the Bible until '91 when I was in the county jail. I was raised in a family with other siblings, and I was abused. By the age of 4, I was sexually aware. I was first exposed to pornography when I was around 8 years old. Everything from Sears catalogs to Playboy. As I grew older, I kept feeding that addiction to lust. And for most of my life, my idea of love was physical relationships. I got married. I had 2 children. I joined the military, and during the time I was in, I got divorced and I had custody of my children. I moved back home and I met a woman and we got married. And throughout my life, I was addicted to pornography in nearly every form. And when I got married the second time, it continued. For a while, everything was good. And then I lost my job. Being addicted to lust, the only way I could medicate myself was to do the thing I was familiar with, and I had an affair. When that ended, I looked for another high. Unfortunately, that was in the form of abusing my daughter and one other girl. No one plans to become a sex offender. I was arrested and went to the county jail, and that's where I found the Bible for the first time in my life. I sat down and during the course of 4 days read the entire Bible, and I talked to the chaplain there numerous times, and finally he said, "Are you willing to accept Christ as your Savior?" And I asked him, would he accept me? And he said yes. From there I was convicted, and I went to prison, and during the entire time, God not only protected me, but he provided me with the therapy that I needed to understand why I'd done what I'd done and how not to do it again. One of God's greatest gifts is a child's innocence. And I live with the knowledge that I destroyed that in someone's life. What I learned in hindsight was that lust, like any other addiction, is inherently selfish. It puts walls between yourself and everyone else because you learn to objectify people, and it robs you of the things that make you human.
Wasn't that sobering? Proper screening and selection is a church's first line of defense for protecting kids from sex offenders. It's also a church's best line of defense if they ever end up in court over an allegation of sexual abuse. So, you've learned how to screen and select great staff and volunteers. Now let's get down to the second most important aspect of keeping kids safe: supervision. So often in ministry, our best intentions get thwarted by circumstances beyond our control. And if you're like most churches already running lean on staff, let's face it, finding children's ministry volunteers can be a real challenge. But hang in there. In this next segment, we'll take a look at the kinds of scenarios you'll likely be faced with. When I ask, what's wrong with this picture? You'll have about 30 seconds to brainstorm a solution, and that's about the same amount of time you'll have in real life to solve the situation. I guarantee you'll come up with solutions for handling even the toughest supervision challenges in ways that keep your kids safe and protect your church legally. So are you ready? Okay, let's take a look at our first situation in the toddler's room. It's Sunday morning, you're in the toddler's room, and there are 2 adults and 6 toddlers. Well, everything's going fine until one of the toddlers starts acting up. Why? Well, maybe he didn't have breakfast this morning. Maybe he has a tooth coming in. For some reason, he's a toddler. He's having a bad morning. So one of the adults says, I'm going to take him out of the room because we don't want to drag down the other 5 toddlers. Probably a great decision. However, this adult takes the toddler out of the room to go read with him in another area. What's wrong with this picture? As you may have guessed, both supervisors are in the violation of the 2-adult rule. No one is available to monitor either leader's actions. This might not seem like a big deal, but statistically, most incidences of sexual abuse will occur when someone is being transferred alone from one location to another, and the proper safeguards are no longer in place. Here's one way these workers could have handled their situation. While they were both in the same room together, they could have called for backup, because let's face it, they needed backup. When another adult arrives, the adult with a fussy child could then leave the classroom and go into the hallway to read a book where there are other people present. With this solution, both workers have maintained the 2-adult rule while addressing the needs of the one toddler who needed to leave the classroom for a while. Now here's another tip. When working with toddlers, they will often want to sit with you as you play or read them a book. Having the child sit beside you on one knee is a much better practice than having a child directly on your lap. In other words, always try to avoid placing a child in a way that covers your own private area. Are you ready for the next scenario? Good. Let's move on to the preschoolers. Many churches rely on youth volunteers to help fill the gaps in their staffing for children's programs. This is a great way to mentor young people into leadership positions for the future. But there's an inherent risk to putting youth workers in charge of small children. That's because nearly half of all reported sex abuse cases include a minor molesting a younger child. Whenever there's a disparity in power, whether it's because of age, size, or position, the level of risk increases. And whenever the level of risk increases, you need to upgrade your supervision level as well. Look at the scenario in this preschool classroom. 2 adults and 1 youth worker in a room filled with 10 kids between 3 and 5 years old. This preschooler needs to go to the bathroom. We all know that means it's a very urgent situation. So, the youth worker escorts the child out of the room, down the hall, and quickly into the bathroom. What's wrong with this picture? Knowing the increased risk of pairing an older child with a younger one, youth workers should never be allowed to handle children in isolation. Personal activities such as using the bathroom or changing diapers are prime opportunities for sexual misconduct to occur. So whether you're a youth worker or an adult, the 2-person rule always applies, especially in the case of bringing children to the bathroom. So in this situation, it would have been better to call in another adult and then leave the student helper assisting in the classroom. Then the two adults could escort the child down to the bathroom. Now here's a hint. Before letting that child enter the bathroom, check to make sure no other adults are in there already. Additionally, the adults should wait outside of the bathroom door to make sure that no one attempts to enter while the child is inside. It's important to make sure you have solid bathroom policies that everyone follows. Now, let's move on to middle school. Preteen and teenage kids are the most vulnerable to sexual abuse, and they frequently volunteer in a variety of areas around the church, oftentimes in isolated areas. In this scenario, a 12-year-old boy has been invited to assist the worship production team by serving in a dark sound room with a production technician. He probably enjoys messing around with all the great equipment in there. That's what makes it a popular area for kids to volunteer. But what's wrong with this picture? Right away, I'm sure you noticed that these two people are alone in a dimly lit, soundproof room. High risk. Church staff need to identify areas of high risk throughout their facility. For instance, a sound room is a high-risk area. Youth should never be allowed to enter when only one adult is present. And the production booth is only one area around the church to consider. Often, young volunteers will do custodial work around the church. This again may put youth in an isolated, unattended area where the risk level increases. So building child protection programs doesn't just apply to your classroom and children's ministry. It needs to be a church-wide effort to safeguard all children throughout every area of the church. And finally, let's visit the high school ministry. This last scene is a common scenario, especially for youth pastors. Their success relies on building relationships with students, and often, youth pastors will set aside one-on-one time to develop these relationships. Great idea, but it can put both the student and the pastor in an extremely vulnerable situation. For instance, after Sunday night youth group, two kids need a ride home. The youth pastor decides to drive them both home. He drops off the first student and is left driving the second student alone. What's wrong with this picture? What are some other ways this youth pastor could have dealt with the problem of two kids needing a ride home? Well, first, the youth pastor should have called both kids' parents to get permission to drive their kids home. But he also should have made arrangements to avoid being alone with a second student, maybe asking another adult at church to accompany him in the car. It's an extra step for sure, but avoiding any appearance of impropriety, let alone the temptation to do anything inappropriate while alone with a student, is well worth the extra effort it takes to safeguard the kids in our care. Ideally, plan ahead so that you are never in a situation that breaks the two-adult rule. You've done a great job today. Thanks for thinking through this so carefully. Creating supervision policies and implementing them takes time and effort. But without these safeguards in place, you and your church run the risk of being liable for allegations of sexual abuse. As we learned from our roundtable discussion with the experts, sexual abuse claims are devastating churches financially, and they're doing untold damage to entire faith communities. Fortunately, there are ways to mitigate this kind of loss. Watch this next segment to find out how.
We brought Steve on as a volunteer teacher for our middle schoolers. He didn't have any kids of his own, but his energy and passion for the kids was inspiring. We did all the necessary background and reference checks before we placed him as a Sunday school teacher. And then when we observed him in the classroom, he seemed to have such a good rapport with the kids. He could relate to them. Once we saw how well he managed his students, we thought that we had an asset to our teaching program.
There is no, particular profile at which you could look at and say, this is what they look like. As soon as they walk through the door, you'll know it. It's just not a reality. They come in every age, every size, every background and experience and socioeconomic status. There is no one particular profile that you could say, this is the case.
Until the day I got the first phone call. A parent of one of the students had said that she'd noticed Steve instant messaging her daughter on several occasions. There was nothing suspicious about the actual communications, but the parent's antenna had gone up. This kind of after-hours interactions with her daughter made her very uncomfortable.
To be able to identify some of the risk behaviors, what do you do? What are the behaviors you do not do with children? And as you said, Roger, that's an opportunity for the supervisor to talk about the conduct of behavior that's expected with children within the entire context of a volunteer or an employee, and have them sign off on it so there's a sense of responsibility.
I followed up with Steve immediately. I simply told him that a parent called to say she was uncomfortable with him communicating with her daughter, and I asked him to tell me more about the ways in which he interacts with his students.
The risk behavior does not say this person is an offender. They're at risk, and what they're doing is not healthy for the child.
Steve agreed to stop contacting students on the computer and to respect the boundary of developing relationships at church only. And then I documented our conversation. Everything seemed fine for several months. And then I got another phone call from a parent who insisted that we meet immediately in person. She and her husband came to my office right away. Their 10-year-old daughter had told them that Steve had said some things that made her feel scared. He had said something like, "You are becoming a young lady. I can tell by your changing body that you're going to be beautiful. Men are really going to love you." And then he casually brushed his hand over her breast. This was very alarming.
Touch is certainly violating the child or adolescent's body in that. But there are certainly other ways of non-touch abuse. Have it be pornography, have it be dirty jokes, or excessive language in a non-touch setting.
I immediately called our pastor into the office to address this family's incident. They needed to know that we were on their side and that we took their claim seriously. With their permission, we also met with them and their daughter later that same night. Then our pastor called our local child protection agency to find out if these actions constituted a sexual abuse claim that they would need to investigate. We knew that every state has its own reporting obligations for incidences like these, and that we were mandated by law to report any incident of child sexual abuse. Well, Child Protection definitely wanted to investigate the allegation. Knowing this, we then called our insurance company to let them know what had happened.
If anyone out of good faith suspects a child or youth is being sexually abused, you do not reach out to them. You reach out to Child Protective Services.
Yes.
Allow them to take the lead and be there as a secondary support for the child or the family. Not to interview potential offenders, the victim, because the only guarantee we'll have then is that the victim will be re-victimized, because they will be shamed to tell their story several times to different people. And I always say there's a fine line between doing the right thing and doing what you want to do. The right thing is calling Child Protective Services, who are trained to investigate allegations.
We called Steve in for a meeting. It was tough. When he arrived, he was greeted by us and an investigator from the Child Protection Services. We let him know that an allegation had been made against him. The investigator asked Steve several questions to give him a chance to respond to the allegation. At that point, Steve wanted to contact an attorney. He was given strict orders not to contact the young girl or her family at any point from this moment on until the investigation was resolved. We also let Steve know that he would no longer serve in our children's ministry.
Realizing that we have a responsibility to offenders as well. We are challenged to be able to identify them, to remove them from any ministry, remove them from any contact with children, and get them the treatment that they need.
Although we did our best not to let any information about this investigation leak out, both to protect our victim as well as Steve, rumors did start to spread as to why Steve wasn't teaching at Sunday school. We knew that we needed to address our congregation's concerns, so we appointed one person, someone we felt would clearly and appropriately inform our church members about what had happened and what we as church leaders were doing to address the issue. We also made sure that this person was prepared for questions by the media, should the story have spread out into the community.
One of the things that drives me is I don't want to have a mother come to me and say, you knew, and you didn't do something about it. That wrecks me, and that keeps me diligent in the process of looking at ways to improve our system. And that's one individual. Now imagine an entire congregation where they have lost their sense of safety, that this community is no longer safe for them. And when you don't feel safe, you don't stay.
Everyone, our leaders and our members, were stunned that someone we trusted could do something like this. As best we could, we tried to respond to the allegation with compassion for our victim, a young girl who didn't deserve this abuse, and towards Steve, knowing that he was under investigation for a crime that he may or may not have committed. We knew the situation exposed our church to legal liabilities, and we didn't want to do anything to make it worse. Because we called Child Protection Services and our insurance company, we knew exactly what to do.
In our own faith communities and in our ministries, I would say if we are able to identify that child sexual abuse is a reality in our society, even if it's not one of our ministers or clergy persons doing the abuse, fathers, stepfathers, uncles, our church members are being abused. And what are we going to do about it? And in our faith communities, what we have to be able to present is that child sexual abuse will not be tolerated in our faith communities.
You want to know what I pray about before every service? After I make my rounds in our children's ministry area, I go to the same spot and I ask God for one thing. God, please protect our kids. The reality of today's world is that kids are at risk for sexual abuse, even in churches. Keeping them safe from this is my #1 concern, and I'm sure it's yours too. This DVD and kit is designed to teach you what you need to know to protect kids. It's also full of the tools you'll need to implement the best child protection program possible. Reducing the risk is one practical way my prayer, God, protect our kids, has been answered. Thanks for taking a minute to consider your kids' safety. They thank you too.